Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Brian. I'm the host of the Left of Greg show. You're going to be watching the video version of our audio podcast. Please, guys, if you like the video, like it, subscribe to the channel. There's going to be more content on there if you're already a subscriber, and a better way for us to get you guys some more stuff. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below. Check out our links down below to get a hold of us and to actually find out more places where you can get more information about this. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on Facebook at HBPRNA. Remember, all these cases that we discuss and all the discussions that we have are through the lenses of what we call human behavior, pattern recognition, and analysis. So please like it, share it, tell your friends about it, and we hope you enjoy the show. Thanks.
I'm good.
All right, so you guys are good? All right, so we'll go ahead and get started today. We have a special guest on the show, our longtime friend and scientist, information theorist, scientist, aviator, all kinds of things, Mr. Mike Siracuse. So Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Gentlemen, thank you for having me. It's my privilege.
So we're going to kind of jump into a whole bunch of different topics, but I kind of wanted to give a quick little background on you. I know everyone just kind of listened to a little intro for those listening to the audio version, but one of the things kind of to introduce some of the topics we're going to talk about is specifically when we get into information theory and decision theory and all the stuff is you have a strong kind of military / DOD background, both as first enlisted Navy, then you were a pilot in the Navy, and then you did a whole bunch of work as well with DARPA, and then what became right after 9/11, which was TIA, which eventually be called Terrorism Information Awareness, and you were actually one of the people involved in the project of building what became the basically the largest mass surveillance program in the history of the world at the time, I guess. And so that's kind of, you're a little bit where you come from on all this. So as much as you can, kind of give a little bit about maybe about that background and how you got, not necessarily how you got into that, but what that is, because for a lot of people, and especially people listening who don't know about it, would look into that and go, oh my God, what is this? This is some secret magical thing. And it's a lot more kind of dry, sciencey, really hard critical thinking than magic or anything else, right? I'll let you maybe talk a little bit about that as a segue into what we're going to discuss.
Yeah, that's an interesting segue. I think when I look at this, I consider myself right now, and a lot of people, we're sitting on the shoulders of giants. And, the explanation of what happened, after 9/11, is very nuanced.
Right.
Very nuanced. But it has its history way back, in the beginning of when we started to address information theory and information science and the heroes, George Boole in 1850, Claude Shannon in 1947 with information theory, Vannevar Bush. And I think that gets to the primary point that I really want to make today. Vannevar Bush, in 1945, wrote an article that says, "As We May Think," which formed the foundation of really the modern analytic stage. And he was truly a second generation information scientist. Boole, Turing to a degree, first generation, then, Bush and Shannon. And then, really, but I mean, after that, then started this kind of culmination after this horrific event of 9/11. It says, hey, how do we better detect these signals? So much like in your guys' world, it became just at scale a signal to noise ratio problem. And, the fundamental underlying truth, which kind of segues into what I've been kind of doing for the last 3 to 4 years, is that you kind of have to know what you're hunting for. And the bottom line problem is that certain communities didn't really understand how to hunt things, and certain people with military backgrounds knew how to hunt things like submarines and other things. And we just kind of parlayed that into a set of methods that would serve us better post 9/11. So flash to today, my move in 2014, 2015 was to say, hey, if we can hunt submarines and if we can do these types of huntings, we can hunt these fires too, because they're going to get massive. And for the very simple reason that it's an easier problem to a certain degree, is that they're not trying to hide on you. So my background has been, air traffic control, aviation, and I ended up getting into analytics, and I just naturally feel comfortable there. But where I guess what I got to lead that whole segment is that when we look at decision making today, and combination of decision-making, information theory, and learning theory, which have to come together to deliver these services. There's been a lateral expansion of the 2D web. This vertical extension now of the 3D web is the same problem that we face in the military. It's the same problem that a lot of police forces face. The strategic and the operational and the tactical are now compressed.
So
and go ahead.
Real quick, Mike. Yeah, no, because you brought up a bunch of great things that I want to hit real quick, because you just talked about 3 topics. One, we talked about, 9/11 and hunting terrorists, you as a pilot hunting submarines, and then you just mentioned hunting forest fires, right? So
right.
I think that's a good analogy, big picture of what you do, meaning what information theory is, and what you and all these brilliant minds had to do after 9/11 was go, okay, we've got all of this information, all of this stuff out there. So how do we categorize it? How do we connect it? How do we use it? How do we operationalize it? What is it? So these are all questions. So just for everyone listening, folks like you and Greg and I, we look at all of these problems as that at an information level, and something you brought up as a signal to noise ratio. So can you give maybe some sort of like almost like a street definition of what you mean by a signal to noise ratio? Because that has a specific, meaning to it, but it's also a great analogy for even just scrolling through your Facebook feed, right? So if you could give like kind of a street definition of signal to noise ratio.
I'll give it my best shot. Let me just correct one thing that you said. Some very brilliant minds and me at the end of a fire hose.
Well, I categorize you as
20 years ago, me at the end of a fire hose. But
yeah.
I guess my point before I go any further is that, the stuff that was learned back then is so critical to today. To me, it's because I believe we're in the age of systems engineering. So basically a signal to noise is the classic needle in a haystack. And wherever we're working or whatever we're doing or whatever we're looking for, it's a signal in the digital age, because let's face it, everything's zeros and ones or letters and numbers, and everything's transactional. So what you want to do is try to find that needle in that haystack as quickly and as efficiently and as authoritatively as you can. And what we kind of came to understand is, if you're going to find a needle in a haystack, get rid of most of the hay. And tune, like you guys do at the tactical level, tune your sensors. And in this world, everything's a sensor, because again, we're at the operational layer here, and a lot of people are playing instruments doing, this type of sensor or this type of surveillance. And somewhere, like a composer of a musical score, it has to be orchestrated in real time, because everyone has their own experience. So that signal to noise ratio is basically finding, it comes down to clarifying the signal and then empowering the response of the people, whether it's a fire intelligence signal or whether it's a national intelligence signal or a business intelligence signal. I've come to understand that underneath that is a common dynamics and a common method that can be used regardless of the domain. And we obviously right now focus on threat, but in keeping that to the level where it has to go, it's really about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in concert with each other. Because all of those things kind of mesh together, not only in a project management type of perspective, but in a real type of perspective. So I guess in that nutshell, that it's just trying to find that thing that you're interested in, that bit of information, or more importantly, the aggregation of 15 different information services into one service that you can make sense of.
And Brian, if you think back to the time, probably in 2005 or 2006, I'd spoken at Hampton Roads a number of times, and I was meeting with some very smart people trying to get the, not me being smart, but I was meeting smart people trying to get the combat hunter stood up. And the idea there was that I kept getting told from the different services and the different leaders that every Marine was a collector and every soldier was a sensor, and it just wasn't true. And so the idea is that I listened to this guy across the room briefing, and he gave basically a synopsis of getting rid of the hay and the signal to noise ratio. And I go, oh my God, this guy gets what we're trying to do. We're trying to establish context, and we're trying to put meaning to context. And he just does it in a different milieu. So if we can get, by the way, my dear friend Mike Siracuse was the guy speaking, and remember, Alan Turing was castrated, Mike. But the idea was that I was sitting there in the audience going, this guy gets it. And I'm proud, Brian, to say that we've been friends with Mike ever since. And Brian, Mike, and I, folks that are listening and watching, we were all involved in the Future Immersive Training Environment Joint Capability Training Demonstration, also known as the FIGHT JCTD. And On the Shoulders of Giants doesn't even, folks, if you've looked for Schrodinger's cat, it's right on your screen there under Mike.
Yeah, Mike's petting it.
Yeah. So it's just great to have you here. And Mike, what I'm interested in your views on context, obviously, and getting the band back together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's I appreciate the kind of definition of signal to noise and what that means and looking for a sensor. And I think sometimes we forget that. And I'm trying to take it from just my perspective of my little street view that I have as a knuckle dragging Marine of constantly being bombarded by information, right? I know you kind of you use the term data and information a little bit differently, and I think there is some confusion on what data is and what information is. But in general, we would say that everything we take in all day long is little bits of information. Everything from literally my body just sensing the ambient temperature in the room to something I'm reading, to something I overheard someone say, and what a lot of times we don't have, and this is what kind of Greg and I provide really much at a very tactical and operational level, is that gating mechanism for one, a lexicon. How do we articulate this? How do we organize this? And then most importantly, so what? How do we operationalize that, right? And
Right.
you do that at an even kind of, I would say, even a grander scale overall. So can you?
Well, if I can,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I mean, it gets back to, when I talk to coders, they go, well, you don't code. And I say, yeah, but we have a coding practice. We're just at the operational layer. There's a bunch of people playing instruments, say in the COVID world. Now, okay, but are you all in tune? And is it making a score that is going to provide actionable information, insight, hopefully, after inquiry, to people that need it? And I think to get to your point, I mean, it becomes pretty clear to me that one of the big problems that we have, and that's why I think it's important to distinguish between data and information, is when we import data or we import a source, as a human, we do it quite naturally because we associate. Well, that's not what we do with machines. And that's why the signal to noise ratio is really important, because it gives us a provable method that has worked in ASW and throughout, all that type of stuff. And let's face it, there's a science that's required in information at the operational layer. So that coding method, that methoding approach is more in line with what kind of Jobs would do when he said, I didn't play an instrument, I played the orchestra. Well, it's the same thing, but we're not Steve Jobs. We're just a bunch of guys and gals that understand the operational world, and we want to make it more operationally efficient through what I'm now calling, information aggregation services. So it's not about, because we're stripping away the bottom line is you import data. If you strip away all the context, when it gets to the stage, say in the OODA loop where it's observe and orient, let's just say it's import data, and then what's the importance of that? And if there's layers upon layers of statistical engineering and indexing done on top of it, well, at the data level, we're losing something. I think it's become pretty clear that we've stripped the context out of a lot of our sources, and I believe we need a method and a theory that can be proofable to a science to say, hey, can we do this better? Not only at the tactical level where you guys live, but you also live at the tactical operational buffer too, but at the operational layer, but incorporating incumbent the strategic layer, because to me, again, that's the 3D internet now, and it's really personal,
Right. And so I don't, yeah, Mike, this is really good stuff. And you said something, when we talk about gathering information, whether that's on a machine or a human, you said humans associate, kind of machines don't.
Right.
And that kind of leads to context, right? Meaning we as a human, I have the ability to take in a piece of information and apply some sort of context. It's not a 0 or a 1 for me. It's a little bit more descriptive. Like,
well, you almost ingest it in context.
Right.
You're importing it in context, which is brilliant, right? Because there's no stripping of the experience if our mind is clear enough to
And that's kind of the difference between you said that's what a human can do. A machine can't really do that yet. So I know when we all get obsessed with the future of AI and all this and everything, and I love always you and I have had some great conversations over the years, whatever, because I always call you and go, hey, what about this? And then you're the guy who goes, yeah, but not really. You know what I mean? You're the one who goes, yeah, that's not quite, but yeah, I know what Elon Musk is saying, but we're nowhere near that yet. But I think that's an important.
Well, there's an AI hard problem.
Right.
It's the Turing test, and it's tough, it's hard. And it, again, back to what we talked about earlier, yeah, we can focus on threats, and that's important. But when we're building this, machine that can be like a human, strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, threats, always in balance, always kind of responding to each other, but we got to start somewhere.
Well, that apply, and yeah, you're right, and that is what, when you said, hey, a lot of this information we take in gets stripped of its context because of that. When I put everything down to a 0 or a 1 or a very roadmap, or when this happens, I do this. Well, that lacks context, and the subtlety and the nuance of everything that we deal with, especially information, it needs context. So I know we always talk about it at different, at a basic level. We've done a whole podcast on context, just meaning how you observe something or where you observe something. The context is what gives that information relevance. So when we strip too much of that away, that information can become less relevant, right?
Well, I think possibly a better word is experience. Okay. Because what we're trying to do, say in the because when I looked at you guys' website at the bottom, right, and I saw about, we talked about the environment, and then when we talked about, electronic communication, and then through that to human contact, and then delivering these capabilities, and that's what the issue is. I don't want to get too weird out here, but at quantum physics level, it says, hey, things can exist in two places at the same time at the quantum level. Well, we go into the real world and say, well, that's not true. Not really, but it really is. Information is that thing that can exist in two places at the same time. If you have real time, full awareness of something, it's almost like you're there, but with that comes the host of problems that we're talking about. Because of that direct human contact is not there anymore. You're relying on an abstraction and an aggregation of those abstractions to inform you about what's important. And it may be really important, especially because the internet's about one thing, right? It's about the depth of distance. Well, that distance may be 4 blocks if you're in a wildfire situation, you get the right information at the right time. It could be 40 seconds if you're trying to predict a grand mal seizure on someone's arm. It could be instantaneous, real time if you're a Marine on the ground, seeing something in real time and you've got a half a second. But again, underneath that is human analytics. And that point about association is that our machines, it's always been the hope. Back to Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush wrote in 1945, the day that we can and I'm paraphrasing, that we can master our indexing in an associative manner, the way that the human mind does, then we'll be there. So it really gets to that point you made earlier about AI. Are we really after artificial intelligence yet? Or are we just still after augmenting human intelligence?
Well, that's but I'm always like, hey, before we start coming up with new problems, why don't we solve the ones we have right now?
Define them first, too, right? That's about your guys' work. You guys get in there and you say, here's the hard problem. Now, why does it matter? What's our time frame and how are we going to fix it? Where are we going to do it? Who are we going to do it with? What's our intent for doing it? And that same, passion and approach needs to happen at the operational layer. And we know this in the military. We know how to do the operational layer of war. It's why, we have JPACs and everything else. But hence to the civilian world and services that possibly will serve all of us, back to Vannevar Bush, it's time to transition not only MRAPs and, everything else to police forces, but it's time to deliver, say, tried and true methods of detection to the nation, to states, so we can start to get our arms around in the case of these massive firestorms. It's the same thing. We've got to take what we know, our art and science, and apply it. So I guess that's kind of what drives me as an entrepreneur, and still drives me, living in the state and in this country, that, we've got a lot of big, hard problems, but they're not unsolvable. We're going to have to adapt to climate change, unbelievably so. If I could take a second, it may incorporate certain things that we may not be comfortable with in wildfires, such as, hey, General Atomics can build us a sorry to use a specific name, but if a big manufacturer can build us a drone to do certain things, then we can build another drone at $50 an hour that can carry wingtip foam and weaponized foam and water that can get these fires at half an acre. And of course, it's all very similar. We have to prioritize and do everything else. But context.
Greg, did you want to?
Yeah,
go ahead.
So right now, just for everybody that's watching and listening, welcome to our world every day when we're dealing with a brain as big as Mike Siracuse.
Yeah.
So everybody, I want you to, that's in the audience, I want you to imagine leaning back or laying flat and looking up at the sky at night on a beautiful starry night with no other light. What you're seeing is what Mike is talking about. And he's also saying, as nebulous as that is, it's solvable. And what I would like to do now is I would like to change the focus to a straw and be looking just at a straw at one star and give you an example of something like police work. Because we have somebody, the we, has decided that the threat and at bang are the nexus of where the problem exists, and we're only going to look at the threat, then a term like de-escalation and psychological de-escalation loses all of its relevance and meaning. The context of the argument is that we keep conflating the actual problem. We haven't defined the problem fully, and therefore what's happening is we're spread loading our energy, whether that's mental or physical or money, fiduciary and monetary. And what's happening is we're not solving any problems. And so as an information scientist and a decision theorist, people wonder why we talk about decision theory, Brian. And the simple answer is this: if we empower those personnel that are closest, and I'm talking tactical, Mike, if we empower those personnel that are closest to understand what signals we're looking for in their environment and which of those signals likely lead to these outcomes, then we can use, in the police work context, a psychological de-escalation approach that'll work, that'll improve training, that'll impact the bottom line and address the situation that's going on in the United States right now. But that self-same assessment and data analytics would work for COVID, would work for future problems, would work for a Zombie or an invasion. So for anybody that's listening that's thinking, hey, I don't think I think at that high a level. Now, what Mike is doing is Mike is looking at a map on the risk board and deciding where to put his troops. That's all he's doing. Mike, is that a fair assessment? I know I kind of brought it down, but is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
No, that is a fair assessment. Because even when we look at any of the issues that we have, what is the hard problem and why are we trying to solve it?
Yep.
So we say that we have this problem in the police force, but it's not simple as that. Every day there's tens of thousands. I grew up with a cop's family. I'm a cop's kid, and a lot of good people get good things done, and there's some others that don't. And transparency. So what's key, I guess, is that everybody at the tactical level likes top cover, and that's really what we're talking about. What's that operational layer of information that I can count on? Because right now I'm getting bombarded with stuff. And you say it as as an infantry guy, it's nice to know that you've got that top cover. And I think it's the same thing in that, because let's face it, in human nature, if you're kind to somebody, I guess it was Madison used to say, to be kind to everybody you meet, but have a plan to kill them. But it's tough to be kind because people perceive that as a weakness. And, so again, it's that constant, we're asking a lot of people on the tactical level, whether it's infantrymen or cops on the street, because they're being...
You bring up a bunch of good points, and Greg, I appreciate you kind of narrowing that straw a little bit for us, because, that's what we mean. And Greg alluded to it when we say, hey, we got to stop thinking at bang. And then everyone goes, well, now we're here. It's like, no. I get that you're a few minutes before that, but you're still looking at the problem when it presents itself. We're not clearly defining the problem sometimes.
Can I add one thing, and just because I'm a little bit passionate about it, because it's related to fires and everything else.
Yeah.
And I did jury duty too, and it became an issue. The weaponization, if you will, if you can allow me that statement, of 911 calls by the person making the call is a dangerous situation from an information theorist scientist perspective. Because you have all of the problem. The context is stripped away or is defined by the person calling, because the person who may be on the other end of that may be the innocent one. And then it gets subtracted away to a police officer. Now that I know there's a lot of, but that cycle right there, I think it was Patriot. It's a great show, and it said that the straightest way to get from point A to point B is a circle. And it's so true in what we're talking about in analytics, and yeah, it's easy to be black and white and say, I'm either going to do this or that. And for a lot of years at the infantry level, that was okay. Not it was okay because we didn't have the top caliber information. A lot like a sailor going out to sea, and having his own ship. Yeah, that's what you had. You got some orders, you got commander's intent, go fill it out.
Yep. Yeah. But Mike, and I apologize, Brian, but Mike, you just hit on something that was like a core argument in Fight JCTD, and I go back to the every marine collector and every soldier a sensor. We cannot say that this young person that's about to be deployed to combat, or this officer that's newly minted from the academy can go out there and have all of the metadata and all of the analytical background and all of the tacit and experiential knowledge that they need to operate on the road. It's absolutely impossible. And then going further to say that a computer will be able to do that. What we have to do is we have to
not on metadata.
No, it's not gonna. We have to reorient where that data is fed, where it's taken, and what the intent of the information is. If you don't do that, if we continue to look backwards, if we continue to use the lenses of our ancestors, we're going to miss the point completely. And the idea is that we have to adapt and overcome using all of their genius injects that we've forgotten that we got to blow the dust off of all the stuff that's in there and actually utilize it to meet our goal. And we're not there yet.
Yeah, I want to roll back on something because I think it's important. When we talk about, at all layers, right? Like there are decision makers at all layers, so they're all kind of tactical in their own regard. They just have different time and space issues to concern themselves with, because there's a real human at the strategic level sitting there making a decision. They may be on a 5-year timeline, but they fully understand that there's a 5-minute timeline too that makes up that 5 miles. So what I want to kind of get is that, and I'll throw, that fractal nature, that self-repeating nature, that humans are humans making decisions. So as part of that, as we talked about the signal and noise, it's really, really important to recognize that it isn't an either or. When you're hunting a submarine, it's when you get in the lips that's in the middle of the ocean, it's a possible submarine. With some certainty that 15 hours ago, within these, 100 so miles, there's an 82% probability there was a sub. And then you take an asset like the P3, the mighty P3 Orion, you fly it out there, you drop some buoys in the water, and you try to take that possible signal and turn it into a probable signal, because you're building this heuristic. It's not either or. Just like when you're an infantry guy, it's possible, it's probable, and then at some point it becomes certain. So I think it's really, really important at the tactical, the operational, and the strategic level to understand as the humans, we kind of go, in the machines, we have to go through that process, possible, probable, certain. Now, when you're hunting things that don't want to be found, there really is no certain. I mean, it's kind of like the movie where they were hunting with the pods in the water. There is no certain because they haven't done anything yet. That was the problem we had prior to 9/11. But we do have a pattern in the history and things that we can fall back on, what you guys do naturally at the tactical level to indicting people, that we have history and we understand patterns, and really that's the key of it. And if you want to make an inference or find a causality in a pattern, you have to make sure that you go through a rigor of possible, probable, certain, as best as I can be that I believe this.
Well, and the great thing, we only have to achieve the level of likely. Reasonable suspicion, probable cause only assumes likelihood, Brian, and artifacts and evidence to support a reasonable conclusion. That's the beauty of this.
Well, no, too, and that also is what makes these hard problems. And you both kind of alluded to it before, and Mike even said it, earlier. Like we're putting, specifically for like a law enforcement example and what's going on in our country. I don't think sometimes people realize, not even police officers themselves, not even not even anyone protesting or either for them or against them or wherever you stand. I don't think they've clearly defined the problem where they realize how complicated these situations can be. Now, I say complicated because we have answers, we have solutions. It's solvable. It's not some weird, complex, nebulous thing, but it is a lot. And so, like you brought it up because that went into the strategic corporal concept and the 4-block war and all that stuff. Is that a 19-year-old kid, because that's what you are at 19. I don't care if you're in the military or not, right? 18, 19-year-old kid can make a decision at a very tactical level that will have massive, massive strategic influence. That's no different than a police officer at a tactical level makes a decision that has overwhelming strategic consequences. So
and then it's no different than from the other end of it, from a from a threat perspective, that someone may weaponize a COVID, one person, and introduce it in such a way, or start a fire like down in Big Sur. It's the butterfly effect, right? I mean, but it's not, I guess, the classic butterfly. It's not that the butterfly is going to create a tornado. The butterfly is going to create something directly related to it, and the question becomes, can we, in my mind, the question becomes, can we provide the same level of time and space command and control, for these other problems, much like we do in the military, without being onerous and overbearing, but letting that 19-year-old kid, again, or that 25-year-old hop on the street, or the firefighter, whatever the case may be, that they have top cover, and that information that they're getting is as pure as it can be. And I know pure is a tough word, but that's why the signal noise ratio thing is so important. It's trying to put math against this problem of context.
And that's what you mean. Tell me, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what you mean by a signal, right? A signal can be a number of things, but your signal, the information you get from a signal is only as good as your signal, right? So now you get into false positives, false negatives, meaning
absolutely.
If I think I have a good signal, like you always give, which I love, is because it's a very simple example of artificial intelligence that everyone understands, is the smoke detector in your house. It's got a very, very simple job. It detects smoke. When it detects smoke, it beeps really loudly. When its battery gets low, it does that annoying beep where you can't tell which one it is in the house, right? So
it's standalone. It doesn't really even need, it could have a battery or backup power.
Yep. And so that's
the classic sensor to shooter. That's what made the P3 such a mighty airplane. Another great air. If you can sense something, both be informed at the strategic, kind of run the operational, and then be there at the tactical.
And I just want to use that as a very simple sensor that everyone gets. Okay, hey, that's a very simple. It's very effective, right? And obviously you're concerned about a false negative with that one, right? Where it doesn't go off,
or false positives. Sure, I mean, it's always about false positive, false negative. You have a false positive, somebody jumps out of bed and they break their leg. It's like,
exactly. So you're guarding against that. I just think that's a good example, and we often don't, and what you talk about, and you give the analogy because it's perfect from your anti-submarine warfare, background, and what you talk about, flying a plane. And then you're going to drop buoys, which is a sensor. So you're dropping this, instead of smoke detector, the sub detector, right, in the water. But even if we have the best sensor, and hey, this is really great, and it's very simple, and it works very well, and it's extremely accurate, it has a low level of false positives and false negatives. Well, I could have the greatest sensor in the world, but if I don't put it in the right spot, if I don't use it correctly, if I don't implement it,
right,
well, then I get nothing.
And you also, but again, we go back to the composer and the the conductor of an orchestra. You've got multiple sensors too, right? Like, and this is very relevant if anybody's interested in the autonomous vehicle world, or even the UAS, UAM, AAM world, and even at the tactical level, right? Like, it's important to know that if you're going to be using these systems, what the logic is that's providing the information that you're going to be taking actions on. So it is relevant to everybody that's going to be playing with these toys and involve themselves in this kind of world. But again, that concept of aggregating sensors is everything, because when you're hunting a sub, it's not just a buoy, it's a camera, it's a set of eyes.
Right.
It's Doppler. Doppler never lies. And the only thing that I know of, and it's, because every time I talk about the AI at the executive level, I say, if there's a hurt factor involved, then it requires full transparency. And a hurt factor can be an algorithm or set of whatever they call them that do what they do to decide if someone has bail or not. Well, that needs to be fully transparent. So it's not the sausage factory and you can just do some statistical engineering and throw something out the other end. No, people need to see that, because people's livelihood and their lives are on the line. And that becomes obviously much more important when we start talking about weapons release authority, which in and of itself is not complicated, it's complex, because one simple loss of contextual situational awareness, and you could make a decision, especially if you're hunting something, in time, because the reality is these signals, all of them, if you close your eyes and close your ears, you may think they're not moving, but they are. I mean, that's the big, you know what I mean? That's the big challenge, whether it's at the tactical level, the operational level, you know, whatever your time frame is, you know, used to be an old saying in ASW, just because you don't hear them doesn't mean they're not
Doesn't
moving.
mean they're not there. Yeah, got it. Yeah.
Well, let's tie that into the gift of time and distance, and let's go back to our straw for just a second, Brian. So you guys both brought up some incredible points about the smoke detector. So smoke detectors work. Some are hardwired. Some should be battery operated. You should change them every year on a specific date. Now we augment, huge important word, we augment that by having the local fire department send a person through, and that person comes through and conducts an audit, a vulnerability assessment of our facility, and says, don't block that door open. That's a fire door. That'll create a vent. We go downstairs and say, look, all these boxes, all these old newspapers, we have to move them away from the water heater because that's a fire source. What we do is we identify the problem, and then we try to move as far left of the problem as possible and augment the technology with virtual reality, with augmented reality, with human sensors that receive training. So people sometimes ask, why do we push training so much? Because without training, you won't know. If you have a fire extinguisher, fire extinguisher is at bang. If you have a smoke detector is at bang. Those things are wonderful, but it's like the police officer relying on the weapon or the less than lethal force. We've already crossed the threshold of use. Mike, your asymmetric submarine warfare and your anti-submarine warfare was designed to give an advantage, technical and tactical advantage of time and distance, so you wouldn't get smoke checked, but so they couldn't launch missiles, let's say, against the coast. All of those things presuppose that here's bang, and there's all of this time and distance over here to the left of bang where we could make a big difference. Isn't that a fair assessment?
Oh, it's totally fair. And it really gets to like my bigger passion, which is, you know, I like to look past theology, philosophy, and science and say, where do they all agree? You know, and the only conclusion that I've come to is the best place to find that answer is in music. You know, it's like Zappa said, all that other stuff, but music's the best because there's something that happens at a vibrational level. But what you said was, was spot on. Whether that left of the bang is a business intelligence signal that's going to hurt your company, or whether it's a fire signal that's going to hurt your community, or something that's going to hurt your body, again, that constant balancing of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats at all three layers, you know, teams working there to figure out the physical things, and then understanding that the physical things are this. Then at the operational layer, we augment those physical deficiencies with actionable information based on the patterns and the things that we know are going to happen. And that's why I go back to the, you know, going past theology, philosophy, because it's like a story. What we're creating here, whether you're creating a 3-minute, 30-second song or a movie or a digital service, we're creating an experience. And that word right there is the most important word that I can think of that ties together, you know, when you're looking at that straw and saying, okay, but I want to look at the whole sky. What are the things I should think about? Experience. And because that's what we're trying to recreate for people, and say, hey, you're here and the internet's about the depth of distance, and I want to make you informed about something here because I need you to do something here that'll preclude something from affecting you over here. Well, there needs to be a composing and an orchestration, or a composing and a conducting and an orchestration beforehand of those events in such a way that we understand them before we code to them.
Brian always talks about that, Mike. Brian always had that moment where he looks and he grabs his chin and he goes, I see what you've done here. And we all laugh at the Mike Myers, because I think, Brian, I think Mike's analogy of music is spot on.
Yeah.
Because the variety of music, have you ever listened, like you're listening to Tchaikovsky, for example, and somebody's going, Chai who? And then all of a sudden you hear Levon Helm and the band. And then you're changing the channel. See, I can't do that. I can't remember the thing, but it's like Paragon. It starts with a P, where all of the music in a theme come up. It's a program.
Pandora.
Yeah, Pandora. I'm sorry, because I don't listen to social media.
Right. You want different varieties.
Yeah. I like a different variety.
Have you heard about this company called Apple? Have you heard about that?
No, but I hear they're doing great
more
things.
Than what you just
need,
but it's okay.
but you get my meaning, that certain music appeals to certain parts of our brain, and that stimulation, that external stimulus, that you know.
Can I get a little bit more specific on that?
Please.
And I don't understand it completely, but what I do understand is that, you know, the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, and then music kind of meets in the middle. And I don't know the official names and all that, but And I want to roll back on something because I think it's important. When we listen to music, it's an experience. Whether you're sitting on a couch or whether you're sitting at Big Sur, it's an experience that you live through for those 3.5 minutes if you're engaged. But rolling back to the fight JCTD and what's important, say, to street cops, and let's just say like there's some work that we want to do with the Naval Postgraduate School focused on how do we make ethical use of unmanned systems for our police forces. We've got a hard problem, and let's just say as a whimsical thing that a lot of people believe the hard problem is we don't want warriors, we want guardians. Okay, whether we buy into that or not, but there is a movement towards de-escalation and all the stuff that you do. I'm sorry, I just lost my track.
Yeah, Naval Postgraduate School. You said something.
Well, no, but it goes back to the fight JCTD. That's right. What we're trying to create is an experience that gives them an inoculation. One of the things that we recognized early on in the fight that we were doing an inoculation of sorts.
A stress inoculation. Yeah.
All training, is kind of an inoculation. And what I find still surprising, even after 5 years and then, being distanced from it, there's still a problem in the DOD in the fact that, hey, there's only one reason we educate and train. That's because somebody's putting a uniform on and putting their shit on the line. Let's never lose focus of that. And then my focus now, and I know your guys is to say, okay, how most efficiently, and again, like in this global consciousness that we talk about the internet being one synapse for this group of people, how do we do that as authoritatively as possible?
Right.
And as authentically as possible to give them the experience that they need to make the proper decision.
No. Yeah, and Brian, here's another lexicon argument. The authentication and the level of experience and having an aggregate, but a pure signal, that's all important, because what's happening is there's some people that are listening and watching and going, oh, I think he means that the user experience should be good. That's not what he's saying at all. What he's saying is that we've got to try to get the most pure information possible at the beginning to have the outcome be something that's very close to what we're trying to accomplish. And defining that problem is as important as defining that goal. So that's a great statement.
Absolutely. Like when you're doing an ATO, an air tasking order, right? There's a bunch of people sitting in a room making a whole bunch of decisions, but every one of them that has the value of knowing what they're doing there understands that there's a kid turning a wrench. And you have to concern yourself with that, and that gets into the whole thing about supply chain management, not post-COVID, but it's all pretty much the same physics at work. I guess that's my main point, the physics at work. So
go back to your orchestration, and I think of the band as well. Brian, I think one of the points that you and I see, only because Mike, we get flooded sometimes when people send us articles about what's happening right now in the state of police work. And I would turn that around and say, listen, this has always been happening. You now just opened your aperture to take a look at it. And you want to make an uninformed decision based on whatever criterion that you've decided, and you're not looking at the context and you're not weighing each individual situation. Isn't that the same problem you're talking about, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to say it's a pet peeve, but it's a general problem that seems readily apparent, is that when we as humans tend to learn something new, it's brand new to us.
It's the Charles
Manson. The people that have been working the problem for 100 years.
It's the Charles Manson quote.
Yeah.
Hey, if I haven't seen it before, it's new to me.
And they get to that with, somebody did some studying about flat earthers, and if I offend anybody, well, I don't care, so get off the.
No, we rip on them all the time on here. So
we really do.
But what they tend to find out with flat earthers, and it kind of expresses itself in other ways, that some people, if they don't experience it, they don't believe it's true. So if I can sit there and say, hey, the earth is round because I've flown over the North Pole at 200 feet. It's round because every direction south. But unless they've done that, they're not going to believe it. And it's the same thing here. So I guess what I would advocate, back to our, one of the themes that we talked about earlier, sitting on the shoulder of giants. I'm at the point right now where I want to build the bands together that we can stand on those shoulders. And what I kind of consider is, for the last 5 years and definitively the last 9 months, I've had to crawl up the back, even after working with these guys, crawl up their back to get just the ability to sit on their shoulders. And that's how hard it's going to be to stand on those shoulders, because this stuff is hard.
Well, that's kind of goes back to what I was saying before, and that is a big problem. Greg brought up, you just brought up a great example with the flat earthers. Unless I've experienced it, it isn't real, or all this stuff. And this is that's with any what has become known as conspiracy theory or something that becomes this emotional reaction. Everyone's all of a sudden, did you know this? And I'm going like, because that's what's going on. There's another one with this whole everyone's a pedophile. I don't know. Apparently there's this huge, and I'm like, are you just becoming aware of crimes that are that have been happening in society for a very, 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 very long time? Because that's what it seems like to me.
Well, a lot of them are
And
societal crimes too, systematic.
well, right. And so
trying to convince millions of I won't go there, but millions of people that have been systematically abused to trust systems nowadays is really hard.
Yeah.
Yes.
No. And
they're afraid and they're yelling.
You brought up kind of systems management, and like there's not a lot of trust in our systems because of that. And now all of a sudden there's this, and this also gets into information theory of I'm bombarded with so much stuff.
It's totally information, learning, and decision theory every time. It's that old analogy. We don't do 1 billion transactions. We do 1 billion transactions one at a time.
Well, right. And that's a good way to look at it, because I always, what we always try to do, or always try to tell listeners or people I know is like, look, one, if you're having an emotional reaction about this, it's odd to me when it doesn't pertain to you or you have no actual connection to it, right? So like, Greg will send me something like about another thing that happens in law enforcement, this, and I get it, because you know what, Greg worked really hard for a really long time as a police officer and seen the change and seen how things work. So I understand the emotional reaction. When I see something happening with the military, this, I might get that, but I have a connection there. So there's that issue right there that I'm a little confused at, but we don't have to get into that. But the big thing is this kind of that information overload of people don't realize how difficult and nuanced a lot of these problems are. And we oversimplify the problem, which means we oversimplify the solution, which means we oversimplify how we legislate that, how we decide, how we vote. And so what am I supposed to do with all this information that I get? How am I supposed to know what is what and what's a good signal? Like the pure signal you talk about, that's what I want to get my information from. But how do I know if I have a pure signal? And these are difficult problems. I'm not expecting an answer out of either of you. I'm just kind of more or less venting on it.
Not so much an answer. It's like, okay, number one, are we asking the right questions, right? And I think we are. As a group, are we asking the right questions? And then number two, recognize what is, in the field of information theory, what is the hard problem? Mm-hmm. Well, the hard problem is, right, it's like a general intelligence for a machine. Well, okay, Alan Turing, we know, Bad Apple and everything else. It's a shame that a man that, literally saved the West from Germany with his work in information theory and developing Christopher. And what I find most interesting about that, if you take Christopher, the first computer, and now you take today's chips on silicon, they're the exact same structure. They're just now the size of, half a Connecticut if you exposed them out to Christopher as the machine. But I guess to my point is that, okay, what's the general hard problem? And again, I fall back on, we've got to, as a company and as an entrepreneur and as, a theorist, we've got to clarify these signals. And those signals are much like in program management for modeling and simulation. We can do anything, but you can't do everything. If you want to solve the hard problem of detecting grand mal seizures on a human being, that's all you can do. Now, you may be able to aggregate those things later on, but it gets back to what we talked about earlier. It's a whole different ingestion. When we talk about, if I've got let's just say I've got 100 books that I'm really interested in, that I think hold the essence of my future, and I'm 20 years old, and I want to sit 12 hours with that and do an associative exploration of that. Well, yeah, you can do that with an elastic search engine and some microservices, or you can change your ingestion method, your import capability. And that's kind of where I'm at, because it isn't so much information overload, I think, that's happening with people. It's information confusion. It's confliction. The first word is always wrong, but is it? Sometimes the greatest insight's in the first raw thing that you get. It's not everything, but when put in the context of someone else's experience, and that semantic and that ontology starts to really matter when we start to talk about, let's take, for instance, something a lot of people are familiar with is the OODA loop. You observe, you orient, you decide, and act. And I don't really, it's not that I don't support that as a Marine on the ground or in certain contexts as an aviator, but it doesn't work at the operational level because we sense things, whether that sense is from a human or whether it's from a database or whether it's from a unintended ground sensor, don't really care because it's a specific intent. And then we orient, or to put it the other way, we import stuff and then we try to understand its importance, and that to me is universal. Whether you're a cop on the street, whether you're a Marine, whether you're a boardroom guy, there's a universal physics, I believe. That may be a counter.
Yeah, no, it's a grand unifying theory. Brian, to tie in what you said.
Unifying theory, yes.
It really is. To tie in what you said, Brian, and a great point, and dovetail on yours, and tie in what Mike's saying for our viewers and listeners. When you take a look back when I was growing up, and I'm older than both you guys, back when I was growing up, on Thursday night, there was a TV show, and at the beginning, you had a choice, so you didn't know what it was going to be. Was it going to be McMillan and Wife or Cannon or McLeod? And it showed a guy with a flashlight going through, and there was a song playing in the background. It was a misty day, and he was walking around with the flashlight, and at the end, you figured out what you were going to get. That's what search engines are like. There's so much information, and there's not detailed information being onboarded, so you have this vast array of signals. We're right back to it, and most of those signals end up being noise because they're not the specific thing you're looking for. It's not intuitive, so you have to create that ability to be intuitive. Isn't that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, when I think about it, I call them analytic engines now, just to have a simple building block, right? So let's just say that search, which is now past 22 years old, operating on metadata and its current constructs, and it's got problems, right? I mean, search engine optimization, corruption, all of it, but it's still amazingly a great capability. Second generation analytic engines is what I'm focused on right now. And what I'm looking at is the art and the science of an inquiry. Assuming that a person has a knowledge and they're waiting on some type of trigger, an event or something to actionalize that knowledge into what they're getting paid to do, which is make inquiries about things that are being made so they could gather an insight to make a decision. So that's where I'm kind of at. So I believe that second order analytics, second order or second generation, and I don't want to call it a search engine because the human mind doesn't search for memories, it selects memories. So back Mike, what Bush and others had said, we have to change our import mechanisms in such a way that we can maintain the importance of that import without stripping it away and then reestablishing it. So resiliency can only go so far, I guess, is my major point. Is that more true than the air traffic control system, by the way?
One of our good friends
can only take that resiliency so far.
So, anyway. So Mike, I want to throw this in here just because you were just talking about it, so it's a perfect spot. Is that one of our good friends of the program, Brian Shea, who's a brilliant guy, who's been in the intelligence community for a long time and is just really, really smart guy. He kind of wanted almost a direct. He kind of brought this up and said, can an AI system, be trained to be more analytical by having skilled, trained analysts feed it data in the machine learning process, find the threat tied to the classic, so what? And my immediate answer is, he actually kind of said it, can an AI system be trained? Because that's what we call it rather than machine learning. We call it like, hey, it's got to be machine training. And you have to kind of manage your expectations on what you want it to do. And the more focused it is, the easier it is to accomplish. Would that kind of make sense? Or
yeah. If I may, I'm going to flash back a little bit here. Let's go pre 9/11. The big problem was the FBI was in the business of proving things happened, and the CIA was in the business of predicting things would happen, and no one was in the business of hunting, which incorporates that actual on the ground and prediction. So it's all of it. So I think that same approach to analytics matters. It can't be just broken up into segments. Same with the fire world, Yeah, you want to educate. Yeah, you want to detect, and you want to put them out. But those aren't separate. They shouldn't be driven by the funding sources. And in certain ways, they become in competition with each other. So again, back to aggregating information in a way that matters. It takes that discipline. At that level. So when I look at the intelligence world, for example, what do we need machines to do better? If you look at it from just a classic sense, we collect information, then we assess it, and then we respond or we make a decision about it. Humans are great at analysis. So if we spend less time collecting, which we spend way too much time even today doing, and we spend way too much time reporting, and if that's a bell curve and a graph, you look at it, you go, we want to flip it upside down. We want to have machines right now, so you train them let's train them to be an inductive sensor for us to feed our observations in such a way that we can give them some autonomy to do that. But the analysis is what humans do. You know, DARPA did this work in 2006, 2007, 2008, where they said, hey, we want to take these we want to take diplomacy, information, or military and economic models and put them all together. And after, you know, a couple of years, they said, well, the only thing that can do that is the inches that live between the ears and the human mind. Well, okay. So let's always remember that human in the loop is going to be there for the foreseeable future as part of that education, training, and subsequent learning for machines. And I take a little bit of issue at times with machine learning before there's training, because it's kind of whimsically saying, well, it's going to train itself. It's like, no, it's not.
No, you don't want anyone.
Look, it will, but not in a way that may be favorable that you can track or be transparent with.
Well, and I do simple terms. It's like I always use the gym example. Like, what am I going to do a better? Where am I going to get a better training program and workout? Is if I just go come up with something on my own that I think I need, or I go to an expert and say, hey, you tell me what I'm supposed to do. And that's the concept there. Go ahead, Greg.
No, you're right on, Brian. And what you just did is made my point for me. Listen, Mike, I take umbrage to when I hear people say human in the loop. Because I changed everything when we were designing supervised autonomy to be computer in the loop. Because I want the computer to give me the cues and set it out for me well left of bang that this is what's likely. And using your analogy for fire, using your analogy for health systems, using that same analogy for COVID, it all works. You think of the Will Smith movie, the iRobot, and I think the actor is James Cromwell, which is talking about asking the right questions. Listen, we could not get the designers of huge programs to understand that a person laying face down in the prone is more significant than a person standing and walking around or reading the newspaper. And then if we took just that simple face down prone position and we put that person in a geographically significant area and then added orientation towards a potential target, you've got the mother lode of information of that the supervised autonomy, the leader, needs to know. But we're not at that stage yet because everybody's still fighting with bandwidth and frequency, and they haven't solved the base problem that certain human factors lead one to a reasonable conclusion that this event is about to occur. I mean,
Greg, that was
what
you just did.
Absolutely.
Though that's a perfect example of providing context, right? So
right.
that, you know what I mean? Like, okay, a person laying down, you're a bot, you're a drone, whatever you want to call it, some autonomous asset or unmanned vehicle, and you're filming something or you're picking up on something you can see into an area. A guy laying on the ground means nothing. A guy laying on the ground in negative space where he can't be seen from anyone, oriented toward a significant intersection where there's a U.S. convoy coming through. Well, all of that context,
Exactly.
that's what makes that observation significant, right? And that's the point of we're not there yet. We humans can barely do that looking at the screen, let alone have an actual.
Well, that's what the operational layer has always been about, right? Is because I look at it, strategy is about the what and the why. Right, it is. It's the defining the semantic, the ontology, and as we look at machines to do these things, it becomes really important to have this type of discussion just simply. But it's the what and the why. The operational is about the when and the how, and then the tactical or the functional in this case for technology development, but the tactical in real world is the where and the who. And you look at major efforts all over the government. For the FAA and NASA looking at what is an unmanned traffic management system look at. It's like, well, okay, those are all great questions, and we've got plenty of great examples of what to build on if we're willing to be humble enough to recognize that there's three things, in my opinion, that always matter. So when I look at designing information aggregation service to clarify the signal and power the response, I mean it universally, but the things that matter are always up front is safety, security, and access. Always. There's no getting around. If you take the drone world, you say, well, we're going to do all this unmanned traffic management over the internet. I'm like, okay, access. How are they going to do that? Is everybody have to have a cell phone in the drone? And then you've got all these seams, and then because when you start talking about technical terms like remote ID and all these things, these same underlying principles always show up, and it fundamentally comes down to a very simple thing what you talked about earlier, and that's why signal noise ratio thing is so important. False positives and false negatives, man. It's the only thing that matters. If, like, take your prone, discussion and take it to another level, right? You're a first responder, and you have an ability through the house is a smart house, and it's able to give you, because it has a smart drone in it, to tell you that a person that should be prone in this area, and they're 82 years old, is now laying on the ground, and the position that we see them in says that they're in distress. And oh, by the way, they're wearing an Apple Watch. But if you take that same information and you don't have the context, you've got a bunch of signals, right? And then you end up with, and then if you put that with bad policy, you end up with things like Breonna Taylor and other things, because there's aggregation of information that's just, because and it gets back to what you guys have talked about plenty of times. People, for the most part, we see what we want to see. And that was like one of the big problems. And that's what you can't have, like an ASW or time critical targets or, anti-terror. You can't, like, I was an accident investigator, and the number one rule, aviation accident, and the number one rule you learn is, if you step into an accident scene, don't have any assumptions. Observe what the world is telling you. Have a methodology, have a rigor when you're done in that mode, but you've got to be able to see what the information at hand is telling you without that bias. And I guess what I would leave that with is, there's a very fine line between confirmation bias and what are called selective priors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I want my neurovascular surgeon to have a wealth of selective priors.
Right.
What I don't want him doing is operating on a 52-year-old man from last week when he's operating on me.
Yeah,
but that's a fine line, right?
It is. It is
all the time.
It is, and it goes. Greg and I just did a conversation about this, because that goes on both ends of the experience spectrum, right? You just talked about a surgeon, and yeah, can they have so much experience that instead of using those selective priors, like you said, from gathering from what they know, they're utilizing confirmation bias and make a mistake? Well, yeah, absolutely. Can someone with very little experience fall into that same thing because they have no selective priors in that particular area, and now they have this confirmation bias? Yeah, I mean, so that's the issue.
I think it's the bigger problem earlier. I mean,
yeah.
Again, I'll be a little, because it's, it's my group. When you don't have a really sturdy set of selective priors and you want to answer big problems, some people tend to become insufferably arrogant along with their confirmation bias, and just keep building that narrative. We don't want our machines to do that, is my point.
Right. You do not.
Yes.
So one of the simple things about the algorithm for HBPRNA, for human behavior pattern recognition analysis, is it's not an oversimplification. Baseline plus anomaly equals decision. It's not. It's the most simple code that you can have. The product of training, in my estimation, Mike, is that we deliver decision theory, among others, facets and skills and knowledge that we transmit. But it's up to the agency that hires us, the group, the company, the HR personnel, the factory, to become the decision strategist. They have to lay out, these are 3 or less decisions that we'll ultimately have to make. And then the implementation is through their academies and their internal training and their T3 process. And we've lost that ability. We no longer have the skills passed on from a journeyman. We no longer have those skills for the experienced vet passing on. We codified it and said, for cops, for example, we have the field training officer program that makes sure that all these checks are in the boxes, and that'll never go away. But that doesn't build critical thinking skills. That doesn't build the experiential level or the person's ability to create an explanatory storyline. We're not there.
Well, right. I mean, my background, and I know, Brian's and definitely yours, Greg, is coaching's everything. If we want a transformation in military training, then set the conditions and enable the coaches out there, and put everything else to rest for a year. Go out there and see, because like the reality is, like the air traffic control system, most people don't recognize that 90% of the time when people are talking on the radios, it's a trainee, because they have to train in real time, so that reality that what you're doing in real time, but you're still training. Same with flight school, right? Like people say, oh, training's training, but it's like, no, you're still training in an airplane, but there's a big thing there. There's an impact. If you mess it up, you and your instructor, you're going to be a smoking hole. And getting back to what we do with the fight, is that what you try to do with that inoculation. And so I guess if I would tie it together, what that pattern is, the pattern recognition, getting left of the bang, as you used to talk about it, Greg, is just taking experience and taking rigor and balance and saying, this is the narrative that we're trying to master.
We're trying to achieve. Exactly.
You know,
exactly.
so much like a story, you know, when you look at a great movie, you know, there's like three sine waves, you know, and, you know, it's the character, it's the story, and the plot line, and they kind of intersect at plot points. And at the end, they're together, right? And that experience, and that's the same thing we want with our technical services. You know, if we provide a technical information aggregation service to a street cop, when he walks away from that experience, not only is he empowered now to share that with others, but he feels empowered to take the next step to make that information service maybe closer to autonomy, if that's the case, but make it serve us better. And that after action review, which is so inherent, you know, the machines have to be held to the same level. So it's not that we want them to do everything. We have to be very specific about what we want these technologies to do for us, never losing focus on what the problem is and why it matters.
So that kind of brings up, or, you know, leads into, you talked about it a number of times, but what is that information aggregation service? What do you mean by that? What does that look like? Because, you know, there's different types of examples of an information aggregation service. So like a Google search is one, right? I can get on Google, I look for cute videos of puppies or something like that, and it'll give me something there, right? Whatever it is I'm searching for.
Yeah, that's what you're searching for, man.
It's, well,
clear my search engine. If I ever die, clear my search engine. This goes back to,
if anyone wants really, really good information, go to Google Analytics and find out what people are Googling, because it's about, I think the most honest a human will ever be is what they're Googling, because you'll say anything on there that you won't say to another human being. But anyway, but what do you mean by, I would rather to Mike,
and I guess that's what, you know, 20 years ago, everything was metadata. The focus then was to how to automatically create metadata, because metadata still is predominantly the primary map that creates the map and the signatures of what we navigate. What I'm advocating is, for very specific use cases, and hopefully generally overall, is that we need different navigation maps. If I have a machine that can read 60 or 100, back to what we were talking about earlier, if I'm a 19-year-old kid and I'm trying to define my life, and somebody says, here's 100 books, and I've got a machine that can read them, that can listen to the 1,000 podcasts or 1,000,000 podcasts, and that you could sit down at a simple query. So let's roll back to the simple, you know, fire detector. I'm not interested in saying, you know, oh, I want to build, you know, this service that can do all 100 things better than a fire detector. I just want it to do one thing better. You know, if it can alert, and it it triggers, it says I got a problem, either going towards the house, like, hey, there's a fire, or there's this coming, or out of the house, you know, with everything that happens with that, but that trigger mechanism. So what I believe is most important is going back to context. You know, how do we import information sources as clearly and as cleanly as we can, while maintaining their context in a way that will provide people actionable insight? So when I think of a simple, let's just call it a selection engine, I call it an inquiry engine now. You sit down just like you would at Google, and you type, you know, I'm from Buffalo, New York, and I was born in 1960, and I love red roses. And now, instead of getting a list of things, you're literally getting a representation of that corpus of information that you're interested in, because your machines now are literally working at the associative level. They're taking subject, verb, object triplets, and they're creating them and everything is now treated as this discrete entity. So much like the human mind now, I can put in these stupid terms together, but I'm now going to get relevant things. And it could be Alice in Wonderland, you know, or something completely, but you go, oh, and then you start discovering that. Now, that's not for everybody, right? But I think it naturally gets at the way back to what we talk about, you know, data, information, knowledge, insight, right? And that pyramid is real, and there's some other pyramids that matter. The question becomes, what sits between those? Well, clearly there's one thing that sits between those, and it's context. You know, if you want to understand data, understand its context. You know, somebody say 59 degrees. Well, okay, there's a data point. But if I'm sitting there in my room and I'm looking at 59 degrees and I'm standing in Monterey, California, it's not data, it's actionable information. Now I know what the temperature is. I can go to other things and I can get weather review, all that stuff.
And I think that's the important distinction right there, where it becomes actionable information, right? All the data and information in the world, because we like you mentioned earlier, is we're constantly collecting and reporting down to everything, down to I can have a watch on me that tells me all kinds of different things about how I slept and this and my resting heart rate and what I need to do if I set goals in there. And it's like, well, what am I using that for? So what? You know, I always make the joke on here of this sleep study and this whole study I was part of, and they sent me the Fitbit watch and they tell you this, and it's like, oh yeah, you know, it showed this and it showed that you didn't have good sleep here. And I was like, yeah, I knew that I didn't have good sleep. I already knew that. Like that's
Yeah,
not the issue. Like you're just describing something that I already knew. You're just giving me a little bit more detail about it. And you're giving it like a number or a
yeah.
classification, but so what? That doesn't
But it's
help me
still,
sleep at night.
it's just
You know what I
it's a
mean?
transaction, right? So if you take
Yeah.
that sensor though, that watch, because that's one thing I've been focused on just the last few days, like
Mm-hmm.
if we want to predict a grand mal seizure, we can do that. Dogs can do it.
Right.
Now, what we need is multiple sensors and information aggregation service that unfortunately has a low profit model on the other end because it needs to be done at around $5 a month. Right. And when you look at the scale, it's like, and let's face it, you know, even after, you know, 1968, 1950, whatever, the biggest problem in the IT world is finding the business model afterwards, the tail. And that's what we're seeing now is we move CapEx into OpEx money, right? Capital expense into operational expense. It's like there's no tail end anymore. So what do the professional services firms do now? Right. Well, and that's kind of what I think we're on the cusp of. And one of the things that I'm really interested in when I talk about building a band is, okay, what are these big problems? And let's say, you know, like a guy that I highly admire, Steve Lukasik, you know, one of my mentors, he literally VC funded the internet when he funded the ARPANET. And he was always really clear. Steve would say, you don't want to get more than 4 people in a room doing anything.
I agree with
Well, if you get the
that.
right 4 people, if you get an
Yeah.
information theorist, you get a decision theorist, you know, you get a learning theorist, because none of these things are science until they're applied, right, against a specific problem. And then you have a producer, you know, someone that gets the big picture, and you're going after a very specific problem. You know, and let's say that specific problem is, you know, COVID type awareness in buildings for this massive person that owns millions of hotels. I don't know, whatever. And then you put a team together and say, okay, what, you know, bringing in decision theorists like you guys, bringing information theorists so we understand the strategic, the tactical, and the operational. And we do it for 3 or 4 months and we define the problem, and then you figure out a point where you can hand that over. But that upfront work is everything.
Yes.
What's really hard as an entrepreneur right now, you also have to have the back end, because we can get exhausted as human beings if we don't automate our own services, which may be information based too. Everybody talks about automating, you know, machine services. Well, you automate human services too. So I can be in, you know, I can represent 50 people. It's a core of capitalism, right? It's like, but my point is, without that rigor and without that structure, it's really hard to get to that end state, I guess.
Yeah, Brian, do you have I don't know if you don't have a title for the episode, but the one that's been batting around in my mind is Greg and Brian have really smart friends. And then the subtext on that would be, and we're willing to use them. So Mike, I would love to be able to leverage your knowledge and the knowledge and skills that Brian brings to bear and that our team brings to bear, and go after some of these really hard problems. I love that. I mean, that's what people like us love to do.
Yeah.
It was like putting a band together, man. It's not like it may be a new band, because part of us, we're defining, you know, new genres of music here too. It's like, you know, if you can only do one problem, we'll do it well. Like back to your point about that sleep habits. When you're trying to predict a grand mal seizure, if you've got blood oxygen and you've got some type of indication from an EEG, and then you have 3 days of sleep history, whoa, you're really starting to get pretty left of that bang now, right? And when I just want to make one point. When we talk about an analytic, it's really important to understand that predictive analytics do not stand on their own.
Yes.
No analytics stands on its own. And there's a repeatable, again, we're going to do it a billion times, but it's still one thing. You need a descriptive first. This body is experiencing this, and I can get that, and I can trust those signals. And then you have a diagnostic that says, okay, that body is doing this, now I'm diagnosing it. And then on top of those two, you build a predictive, you know, you build on your predictive in the hopes that the fourth mechanism, or the fourth modular part of your mechanism, is a prescriptive that says, okay, I've sensed your body, I've done some diagnostics, I'm predicting you're going to have a seizure in 5 minutes, now I suggest you go do this, some biofeedback, energy distribution, or just yell at the top of your lungs, something. But every analytic requires that same discipline. I see so many times, like, and my favorite one to jump on is Watson. It's like, oh, Watson. It's like, Watson's object oriented, and it's literally applying its knowledge into an object. bison entity, and this new internet, what I'm calling the 3D internet, you know, it requires an individuality that can't be compromised. So if I would say it, in 2010, we were in the age of, you know, possibly the cloud. And by 2015, we're in the age of possibly the platforms. Now we're in the age of systems engineering, decision engineering, learning engineering, information engineering come together against every problem, every time. And we can't kick the can any further, in my opinion. And all we have to do is look around and see where our information aggregation services are failing us. And they really
Brian,
are failing us. Now,
it's
there's a host of
important to know
reasons,
that,
right? It always comes down to hardware, software, and wetware. You know, the wetware is the human condition, and those
Right.
things can't be compromised, and they have to be concerned and understood. So back to your point, Greg, really focused groups, small groups of teams to attack hard problems.
I agree with that. And Brian, quickly, I want our viewers and listeners to know the person that coined the term 3D internet is the guy with the ponytail sitting there in front of the mirror with us right now. So he, you know, he's one of the big thinkers, Brian.
Actually,
well, a lot of people have crafted the 3D, but it was done with VR and AR, and it was like, we're going to create this.
Give a real quick explanation of what you mean. What was the 1D? What's 2D? What's 3D?
Well, the one, I always think the 1D internet was the telephone system. It's been around 100 years. The 2D internet was the World Wide Web, Term Berners-Lee saying, hey, and it was this two-dimensional internet. The three-dimensional internet is what we've been talking about. Yes, it's the telephone system and this ability to communicate in real time, which is really amazing if you think about it. It's again, as I talked about earlier, it's quantum physics at its best when you're on the telephone. Right. You know, so it's the merging of those three things, you know, and then being able to look at those three dimensions in a vertical expanse as well as the lateral one that says, integrating the strategic, the operational, and the tactical. That's part of the three-dimensional aspect of it. And then the other part of it I see is being able to have a method that is capable of capturing all three levels at the same time. You know, back to the simple thing about you know, capturing a seizure. You'll say that's a pretty tactical thing. Well, it's like, no, it's not really. It's all of them. You know what I mean? You got to have a human loop system that understands and is paying attention to other people that are having grand mal seizures, and that may go automated, but they're sharing that information in real time based on what they're seeing, and they may be monitoring that person. You know, in a way that we can monitor 100 signals now, where we used to only monitor one. That makes
I think.
But that concept of the 3D internet is just saying that, hey, it's all local now. Like the drone work, or, you know, UAS work I'm doing is, I have a very simple thing, community-led innovation. If you don't have the community involved in the innovation, good luck, because they're the ones getting affected by these things. And if you don't consider the strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, threats from their perspective, you're going to fail.
And I think that's also how a lot of this technological advancement has opened things up to look at these differently. You can look at it from a community approach. I mean, look at even just how things are happening right now in the US and how different it is across different cities and states and everywhere. And the point of it is that we're getting away from this, hey, we need this centralized model, or this is how we're going to do things, to just what you said, that community led. Like, I've got some successful business leaders here that can work with the city and the people in the community and this to go, hey, we can find our own solution for this area. And now if someone wants to scale that, either, like you said, horizontally or vertically, that's great. But these
I think the scale issue is that you're combining. We talk about scale and we go lateral, but really you can't go lateral until you have that. Like for a city, there's a vertical structure there that can't be abstracted away. It has to be connected and
regional
from
approach,
the beginning.
Well, yeah, and the point of it too is taking that, you know, what works in Chicago isn't going to work in Portland, and that's not going to work in Miami. But not a template problem. We go, hey, they did this here. Why don't we just apply that solution over here?
If I may, let's just step back.
Prototypically, but you can't do it, you know, a template match, right? We can.
Well, the word template, I would say let's go deeper than that. And what we're really talking about here, in my opinion, is the physics of information.
Right.
And that we can discern that as rather universal. I don't care what the signals are. Right? I mean, what's the physics of the information? And every time we have to, and it's really important because in my experience, the best information scientists I've known, the top 3 out of 4 that I've known, were physicists.
Yeah.
Because they get to the core of the problem. It's like a great screenwriter, you know, you've got to get to the core of the problem. What's the story or this experience?
I'll ask for your opinion, Mike, and yours, Greg, as well. What I always tell people is, you know, when, you know, we talk about human behavior and information theory, decision theory, and how these things work and how we interact. And I always tell people when they ask, hey, what book should I read or what should I study? I said, if you really want to understand human behavior, I would start with physics, meaning I think and I'd love to get your guys' opinions, but physics to me is one of the most accurate and best descriptors, right? It's a great descriptive of how everything works. And then everything can layer on top of that. But meaning when you break it down to literally the level of physics, I don't have my thumb on the scale then, right? It's not being influenced by anything other than particles interacting with with waves and particles, right? So if you can do it at that level, at least have an understanding. I think that's, I don't know what you guys would think about that, but that's kind of been what I've found.
Well, Brian, I think it's smart, and I'll start because mine's going to be brief. I completely agree with you, and I'm a pop culture kind of guy, so I'll go to the TV show The Big Bang Theory. And somebody was asking about something on a car, and he goes, are you asking, that Sheldon character says, are you asking about the internal combustion engine? I'm a physicist. I understand everything. And the great thing is that if your background is in physics, then you can build on the sociological, the psychological, the physiological, but you have to have an architecture. And I think physics lends us that architecture. Mike?
I mean, yeah, architecture, right? Again, it's the physics of information. It doesn't matter the use case. What we're trying to get at is the heart of the story, the narrative, the experience. And then, instead of, it was really popular to say that we're connecting dots. Don't connect dots. Work with somebody that knows how to hunt dots, so you're seeing the dots in real time present themselves, because if you're waiting to connect them, you're going to lose. That's just the reality. That's what we're kind of doing in the fire world sometimes. We're just connecting dots. It's like, no, you got to get ahead of that dot. And part of that is having the humans in place that say, okay, I'm interested. I've got this $1 billion problem, right? This company has a $1 billion problem, but there's a signal there. All right, well, how do I build the dots for your systems so they can see that, as we talk about going from a possible to a probable to a certain, right? That same thing has to happen as we're connecting, as we're collecting, and then making sense of these information sources as they present themselves. Because let's face it, until something happens, it doesn't happen, and it's an approximation. And some things we just can't wait. 80% is good enough sometimes. We may take a mitigation effort.
Right.
We have probable cause and we think we're at 60%.
Yeah.
I'll set another sensor on it, or I'll reappropriate something on it and go, well, now I'm at 90%. And narrative saying what it is, because Campbell and Jung told us, the common story is a common story. Everybody wants to be the hero at the end. Their means may be different than yours and their needs, but they want somebody to carry on that message. And I guess it's the same way here. That's where I'll kind of leave it is, when someone is using a information service, again, it's an experience. And in order to completely understand that experience every time, because these things have to be 99.9% good all the time, hence back to why we only go one step past a fire detector, because it just gets too hard right now. We've got to crawl, walk, run, just like we do in training, and just to summarize it all up, I do not believe that metadata is the proper mechanism for moving forward. I'm interested in creating a set of meta context as a new way of navigating. If we can teach machines to read and compile, let's just teach them to treat and compile different mechanisms of mapping. This is no different than exploration we've been doing for, if Einstein would have said, well, I'm not going to do anything because, what's his face did it with the apple, well, we're not doing that. So again, after crawling up the backs of giants, which I know you guys have too, as we're sitting here, what I know, like back to a screenplay, you don't get 20 people in there to write a script. No, most you'll get is a couple, 3, 4, because it's a tough problem, but they're still serving an architecture up. I mean, that's what a screenplay is, for example. It's an architecture that other people can build on. And I guess that's what I'm advocating here. What is the architecture at the operational layer that ties together the strategic and the tactical in a way that is verified, validated, and accredited to provide accurate aggregated information sources in a timely manner? And my bottom line is, I think we need to start over again to a certain degree in the best way. And, there's an over-the-top revolution happening. You asked earlier about what the first D, 3D, 1D, 2D, 3D internet was. The telephone system, the World Wide Web, and now this. And it's going to be different. And we need to, because when I look at the world right now, our country, I would say it very simple and I'll be done. Overwhelming capacity and underwhelming capability. We have all the capacity we need to build any number of services, and our capabilities are, I believe, in many aspects worse than they were 20 years ago.
No, that's actually a really good spot to kind of wrap on for this discussion. The idea of overwhelming, capacity, underwhelming capability. I think that really drives the point home. That wraps literally a lot of the points that we brought up in terms of defining a problem and then defining what the solution is and how we start with it. And I think the physics of it all, is amazing. We talked on a whole bunch of different topics, Mike and Greg. You guys brought up some stuff, and I would love to, maybe deep dive some of these, maybe one at a time. We stick to something and do kind of like a separate type series. I think will be fun. Do some episodes of each one of those and get into great detail about specifically what you mean. And that way you can define it how you define it. Greg will define it. I'll go, hey, what does that mean? My big thing is always with anything, and especially with information theory, is what does that mean for the person who gets their information scrolling through a feed on Facebook? Because that's a dangerous place, and it's not good. Most of what I've seen on there, it's really not. But it's he
says while we're on Facebook Live.
But right, of course. But it can be, is the thing. Is my point is it doesn't have to be that way. I'm looking at it as I'm eternally optimistic, because otherwise what the fuck is this all for? If it's not for a greater cause, or we're going to do better, or things are going to get better, then fuck it. Why are we having these difficult conversations? Why try to solve a hard problem if it can't be solved? And that's my thing with all of these issues that we face, is they are solvable. All right. We got to get rid of the hay, as you say, right? Get rid of that hay to get to that needle. What's an accurate sensor? What do we need to pay attention to? What should we stop paying attention to? What do we concern ourselves with? And that's everything we discussed in different areas on this. So Mike, I appreciate you coming on, and it was an awesome conversation. We got some great feedback here, and I would love to go in deeper on all these topics if you guys want to.
Oh, I would love it.
Yeah, right. Brian, I think you're onto something. I've devoted my life to giving people the confidence and competence to make the right decision at the right time for the right reason. And I think this is a great step into a new direction that we definitely have to drill down into. So I'm ready. Mike, I know you're ready.
Yeah, if I could leave one thing, only because he's so under-recognized, George Boole, who all of this is dependent on, set out to proof God, not as an entity, but as a force. That's what all of his logic and math is predicated on. And he proved it because he said God is real, not as an entity, whatever, mechanism, whatever, but he says God was real because suffering was real. And if you look at all of the work that's been done, and I'm talking the mathematical work, our whole electrical system, our computer grid is predicated on the simple concept that a very pious, brilliant man decided to prove God, and he proved it because suffering was real. And then all the logic that came from that is what defines everything that we do. So I think the point that you made earlier is when we look at this overwhelming capacity and this underwhelming capability, what are the set of needs that need to be prioritized, and why do they matter? Because we can do anything, back to the M&S world, but we can't do everything.
Right.
But right now it's like, okay, we want to do everything, but we're really not doing what we need to do, in my opinion. We can look around, right? And again, clarify the signals, empower the response. But yeah, I would love it. And, at some point, hopefully, we can start bringing other members of the band in and saying, okay, here's a systems engineering expert. Here's a learning theory expert. Here's some counter to their decision theory experts, and say, what would this band look like and what would it start doing? And how would we go about, approaching these big problems? Because we can talk about it all day long, but when we have the methods and the models and the mechanisms and the metric in place to do this through a method, then we can start putting bands together. And, much like Barry Gordy did with Motown, man.
Yeah.
He said, here's the source product, I fixed it. And then he created brilliance and magic. And
just not jazz. I don't trust jazz, Mike.
No.
I don't trust
yeah.
That's no one likes jazz. They just pretend to like it. It's just noise. So
I'm meeting with a guy tomorrow who absolutely loves jazz, and he's a brilliant jazz musician. So I can't say that to him.
Well, I can't play it, but I can certainly talk crap about it. No,
Like that old joke about the conductor, who's the least talented guy in the band or in the orchestra. Well, it's not the guy with 2 strings, it's the guy with 1 string or
right.
wand. Well,
Yeah.
that's true, right? We got the orchestra.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And but guess what? That guy or girl needs to be there. So you need one.
Well, they
So,
hear everything. They
yep,
hear.
that's the point. They gotta hear it all. Again,
And
Mike,
it takes a rare mind, which you guys have, to see the obvious. It does.
I've been told rare mind before, and it was not a positive comment towards me.
I'll agree.
All right, I appreciate you guys coming on. I think that's a good spot to wrap on, and I always end it with, to everyone, don't forget that training changes behavior.